Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Developing a Strong Cybersecurity Recovery Strategy. I am today's host. Thank you all for joining. I have just a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. All lines have been muted to reduce the background noise, and if you experience any technical difficulties, please do let us know by using the chat panel. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation and we will answer them during the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's session. After today's event, please look for an email that we will be sending you with the slides from today's presentation and the recording, as well as a value-added content piece we're going to share with you this afternoon. At LBMC Technology Solutions, our aim is to be your team for everything tech. If you think of a technology challenge or need, please drop it in the chat, the Q&A, or send us an email at info@lbmctech.com. Now, please help me welcome our presenter for today's webinar, Dave Roberts. Dave has been with LBMC Technology Solutions for over 7 years and has more than 30 years of experience in technology management, strategic planning, and technical operations. He specializes in providing outsourced CIO services, strategic planning, and technical operations management for a variety of clients across different industries. Now, Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the first in a series of webinars on the subject of cybersecurity recovery strategy as it relates to an IT disaster recovery plan. You should expect a continuation of these presentations quarterly throughout the rest of 2025 and into 2026. Our topic is one that we would probably rather never have to address or utilize, but we can't escape the fact that we live in a world with natural disasters, and then we're also unfortunately subject to the bad actors that exist in the world. An interesting thought before we get started, a couple of statistics. I won't statistic you to death, but a couple of things that I think are interesting. In 2023, ransomware attacks impacted 66% of organizations worldwide, making it alone a compelling reason for any business to strengthen its cybersecurity protocols. We are firm believers in the security stack and good practices and good solutions around protecting our clients, and mostly in the small and medium enterprise space. That said, small and medium businesses are particularly vulnerable. Though the average incident costs around $205,000 per are lower than those of large companies, financial impact can be devastating. SMBs account for about 98% of cyber insurance claims in a study that analyzed incidents between 2019 and 2023. So if you live in that SMB space, you should probably consider yourself vulnerable. And hopefully what we're going to talk about in this series will provide some guidelines for plan and strategy to help you in the case that unfortunately you do run into a breach event one day. So in talking about the series, so today's session, we're talking about developing a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy, the lead in to the series as a whole. In May, we're in session 2, we're going to talk about risk assessment and data backup protocols. And actually, we're going to talk about risk assessment today as well. That'll be with Van Steele from LBMC Cybersecurity, and our partner Kaseya will have representation on that session as well. August 14th, session 3, incident response planning and communication strategies. Jason Boyd from our team is going to lead that one, along with another partner, Arctic Wolf. And then November 13th, session 4, roles, responsibilities, and cybersecurity testing drills with Scott Augenbaum. And I'll tell you now that if you've never heard Scott speak, it is well worth the time. So please make sure you have that session circled on your calendar for sure, as Scott has a wealth of information and experience and will be very entertaining as he presents on that date. Session 4 won't be the end of the series. I think we'll continue into 2026 as we cover items related to a cybersecurity checklist that we'll talk about later in this presentation today. With the introduction said, Elisa, back to you.
Thank you, Dave. So we have our first poll question. We would like to find out from you, how confident are you in your organization's current cybersecurity recovery strategy? And here is the poll for you to answer. We'll give everyone just a few moments to select their answer. Looks like we've got a few already coming in. Thank you. If there's anyone else, go ahead and make your selection in the poll question prompt on the screen. And just a few more seconds. Okay. It looks like a lot of people are feeling pretty confident, which is great to hear, and we have a few that answered somewhat confident.
All right, let's talk about for a moment what we're going to cover today. We're going to answer a few questions. What is a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy? Why do you need a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy? How does cybersecurity insurance align with a recovery strategy? We're going to talk about the cybersecurity recovery strategy checklist that I mentioned. And then we're actually going to dive into checklist item number 1, which is a thorough risk assessment. So first question, what is a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy? I want to distinguish and contrast between what's commonly referred to as a business continuity plan, BCP, versus IT disaster recovery. A lot of times those terms get intertwined. And we tend to separate those from the standpoint that a business continuity plan is the business recovery as a whole, involving operations, finance, manufacturing, communication with the media, stakeholders, things of that nature that really encompass a holistic business continuity plan. We view disaster recovery as separate from that, but a component within that. I guess I should say it differently, maybe not separate, but a component within the business continuity plan as a whole. So we see a cybersecurity event recovery really being an IT disaster recovery exercise. And then again, that the ITDR, IT disaster recovery, is the strategic aspect of the business continuity plan. Why do you need a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy? In the event of a business interruption or IT disaster, you want to minimize damage to data. You hope in the case of a ransomware event that you can minimize any compromise to your data. Obviously, you want to have your data protected and you want to get your data back if it's been compromised by a bad actor. But as we walk through this and talk about things today, the cybersecurity event can be something that is a bad actor driven event, a breach type event. It can also be natural disaster related. So I want you to keep that mindset as we talk and walk through these different things, that it's not just about a breach event as we talk about these things today. It could be an event that's a natural disaster type event that impacts your business. But you want to minimize damage to data first. You want to preserve revenue generation. So you want to keep on turning the widgets. Can you continue manufacturing or servicing clients through a disaster or business interruption event? If you deal in the space of proprietary information, can you protect and preserve that information from theft? So protecting your intellectual property is important. A breach event can greatly impact your reputation, and we'll touch on this at various points through the presentation. Your reputation is important with customers, with competitors, with the media, with stakeholders, potential investors. Again, we think that's an important part of why you need a strong recovery strategy. And then regardless of the scale and scope of the event, you want to return to normal operations as soon as possible. A strong plan will aid in that effort. And we'll move to poll question 2.
Dave? So poll question number 2, how frequently does your organization assess potential cybersecurity threats? And I'll go ahead and launch the poll question so that we can hear your response. The options are regularly, which would be monthly or more often, occasionally, which would happen quarterly, rarely, which would just happen annually, and then the other option is never. Looks like we have a few answers already coming in. I'll give just a few more seconds for everyone else to respond. Answers are still coming. Looks like we might be wrapping up here. We'll end the poll and share the results. It looks like most people would answer rarely, so just annually. And then second would be quarterly.
All right, so continuing, we're going to talk about cyber insurance, cybersecurity insurance, and how that aligns with the recovery strategy. This is something that as a managed services partner to our clients, we look at quite seriously as we process and oftentimes are the ones reviewing cyber insurance applications with our clients. We think there's a few things to point out here around this. This is not an all-encompassing list, but these are practices and solutions that must align to a cyber insurance application if you have these in place. So immutable backups. So immutable backups are backups that are separated from your network, isolated from common network compromise, or isolated from Active Directory, and separate from most breach type events. They would be considered isolated. Multi-factor authentication is probably the biggest thing that we run across, and wanting to make sure that clients are aligned to that they have a solution in place for that. You might have multi-factor authentication needed for access to Microsoft cloud solutions, to corporate VPNs, might be a separate need for MFA, or software as a service or cloud applications that exist where you may have the need for multi-factor authentication with those solutions. I would also challenge, as you look at cloud solutions for your business and assessing different alternatives, is to find out if they offer multi-factor authentication in that. Endpoint detection and response, often referred to EDR. We think that's a solution that can formulate response to a threat. And then a SIEM, System Information and Event Management. This is typically a more advanced network monitoring and response solution, but all of these solutions are often referenced in cyber insurance applications. And the greatest counsel I can give you on that topic is that if you are attesting to utilizing any of these solutions or other solutions in your application, that you are in fact doing it. There is great vulnerability with attesting to a solution or policy that you don't actually have in place, and if a breach event occurs, it's problematic with regard to your claim. And so the cybersecurity recovery checklist that this series is going to work through, and again, we'll talk about the first item on this checklist today. This approach around a cybersecurity checklist is not a cookie cutter approach. Some items are going to apply to your organization, some may not. I am very certain that every organization's plan is going to be different, as the needs will be different for your organization, and your plan will be tailored to your needs, your situation, your environmental concerns, threats, things of that nature. But here are the 9 items that we're going to review over the course of this series in a checklist strategy. Conduct a thorough risk assessment. We'll talk about that today. Implementing data backup procedures. Developing an incident response plan. Creating a communication plan. Defining roles and responsibilities, and we'll touch on that a little bit in our risk assessment discussion in a bit. Conducting drills and tests, emphasizing continuous improvement, ensuring regulatory compliance, and then finally consulting external experts. That's what the series is going to work through as we go session to session. We'll cover these 9 items on the checklist. And again, some of them may apply for your organization, some may not. You may find other items that you need to add to other than the 9 on this list, but we think this will provide you a good framework for creating a cybersecurity plan in the event of an event that interrupts your business. Sorry. Okay, Elisa, next.
Thank you, Dave. So, poll question number 3: does your organization have a documented incident response plan in place? The options I will put up here on the screen for you to answer. First option is yes, and it is regularly updated. The next would be yes, and but it is not regularly updated. The next would be no, but we are planning to develop one. And the last is no, and we have no plans to develop one. It looks like we've got a few answers coming in. I'll give just a few more seconds for people to respond. All right, it looks like we have overwhelming response with no, but we are planning to develop one.
I think that is actually in session 2 where that will be a topic. All right. In looking at our risk assessment, first thing we're going to talk about is identifying your assets, listing out your critical assets from a hardware, software, data, and personnel standpoint. I can attest to the deeper that you work this plan, the more you'll think about and consider scenarios for your specific organization. When we look at identifying your critical assets, where are your business critical systems located? Are they on premise? Are they in a third-party data center, cloud? A good, solid inventory of knowing where your critical systems are located is important. Take inventory of which systems can be accessed with remote access, and establish contingency protocols if there are physical controls that are compromised in a disaster. Now, what do I mean by that? If your organization requires that access to any of these systems, regardless of where they're hosted, pass through a corporate VPN, then if that VPN or corporate location where that firewall hosts that VPN, if that's compromised in a disaster, you're going to have a contingency plan to access those systems otherwise. So that's something that we see from time to time that would be an item to consider as you're looking at where your systems are located and how you potentially would access them in the event of a disaster. Do you have access to vendor support if systems require rebuild? If you have on-premise systems or systems that you are responsible for hosting in some form, do you have access to your vendor from a contractual standpoint, or do they provide those disaster recovery scenarios as a service if you need elevated or escalated support from a vendor partner in the event of disaster that impacts critical systems? Bear in mind that your critical staff may not have capacity to recover all items, and so utilize your vendor support where needed. If you've been through a disaster, we'll talk about this a couple times, if you've been through a disaster as an organization, your people may have been through disaster as well, especially if it's a natural disaster. And so their ability and their bandwidth to participate in recovery things may be limited. So where you can utilize vendor support is important. Are your backups immutable? We talked about that a moment ago, and do you test them periodically? So backups that are offline, separated from Active Directory, and do you test them? And we would recommend at least quarterly that those backups are tested. And then your people are probably your greatest asset in looking at taking account for your critical assets here. Have you identified your critical human assets for recovery? Create a roster that's updated regularly, something that's stored in a location, probably a cloud resource that would be available in the event that your primary systems aren't available, but you can access that as a cloud resource. Identify your primary and backup resources. As I mentioned, if your organization's been impacted, your people may be impacted too. Having a primary and backup resource in the recovery space is a good thing. Next, we're going to talk about threat assessments and assessing threats, considering malware, phishing, insider threats, and natural disasters. So malware can come in the form of malicious code in a file or an interactive download from a website. So we look at a couple of things that we would recommend here. Is first, restrict your web access to business critical sites. Keeps your folks from potentially going to sites where malware can be contained, where they may otherwise download something they shouldn't. We think security awareness programs are very important in the equation here. According to KnowBe4, and we'll talk about phishing here, according to KnowBe4, phishing resistant multi-factor authentication and regular testing has been shown to reduce phishing susceptibility from 34.3% to 4.6% within a year. The second thing, besides being aware of where malware is on websites and so forth, phishing campaigns, phish testing for your employees is a very critical aspect of a security awareness training and overall plan. From that respect, we are strong on that topic, trains your users to spot suspicious emails and gives them better ability to respond to something that potentially can damage your business. Insider threats. So how well do you know and trust your people? This is something that we don't talk about a lot, but a couple things in that space we would recommend. First of all, segment your sensitive data and protect it by role. So role-based access is an important thing as you look to protect your critical information and make sure that you can minimize unauthorized access within your organization. And then consider systems and policies that can detect internal data theft. It's not without saying that this happens. I could attest to that we've seen that happen within the last 2 weeks, where there was an internal theft attempt and systems in place caught that attempt and was thwarted. Just be aware that can happen. And so your people potentially could be a threat. So again, we don't talk about it often, but something to be aware of. And then natural disasters. We think it's really important to assess your risk to your physical location and staff. Now, I'm a Florida native living in Middle Tennessee. When I lived in Florida, and even after we moved to Tennessee and serviced a client with operations based in Florida, our drills for things change whether you live in Florida or whether you live in Tennessee. In Florida, the environmental things that we're looking at there are largely around hurricane type events. In Middle Tennessee, we look, to flood and tornadoes as greater threats to us here. The runway of preparing for a hurricane that potentially threatens you in Florida is a bit longer. You have that knowledge that a storm potential can impact you. Assessing what you would need to do, what you would need to prepare for in an event like that, again, a little bit longer runway. In a space where you have flood or even tornado, the opportunities to prepare for that is a little bit shorter from a runway standpoint. So there's some things that we would look for you to perhaps do there around that. And that is being aware of weather conditions that potentially present a threat to your business. As you're assessing risk to your physical location around the environmental things that might be in a natural disaster, we'd also have you assess your staff around succession planning, if they're compromised in disaster or pandemic. We weren't thinking about pandemics before 2020, but we now have to consider that as something that presents a risk to organizations. Next item in looking at a risk assessment is evaluating your vulnerabilities. So identifying weaknesses in current security measures. We looked at this in 3 spaces. We looked at this around user access, endpoint protection, and physical. So from a user access and security standpoint, one of the things that we think is important is using single sign-on, which reduces systems requiring password management. So when you reduce your number of usernames and passwords that you have to manage, you're reducing the potential for bad actors and compromise to multiple systems. Password policies, we are strong on complex and rotated passwords. It's something that you'll see again on cyber security insurance applications. It's pretty much on every one I see now. Endpoint security stack. These are the tools and the solutions that are protecting your computer around endpoint protection. Email protection, endpoint protection. That's historically been the antivirus thing. We talked about EDRs earlier, endpoint detection and response. That's what that is there. And then zero trust solutions, where a solution that prevents things that are outside of your norm or outside of allowance to be run in your environment. So we are strong on the security stack. We stay aware of security stack changes and try to bring best of breed solutions to our SMB clients. Physical security, you want to maintain public and restricted access to your building spaces. You want to escort visitors in restricted spaces, make sure that your visitors are not seeing or having access to things on printers and other things that would be protected information. And then control your access during and after work hours, making sure that maybe your hours of access are different between the workday and after hours. Final item on the risk assessment is analyzing impact to determine your potential financial, operational, and reputational damage. So first, in the financial space, look at the cost of layered security solutions and training staff. So when we talk about the endpoint just a moment ago, we're proponents of layered product solutions as they relate to protecting the user and the endpoint. It's not a single solution that does everything. And so we look at a multiple of products that present different layered barriers to threat actors and different behavior activity. The cost of cybersecurity insurance, those premiums will be based on your history as a good steward of your security. Also going to be based on the solutions and the practices that you have in place and that you attest to within your application. The cost of potential ransomware. In that, consider if you were breached in a ransomware event, the cost that a bad actor, or the amount that a bad actor might demand to unencrypt your data can vary greatly. For the most part, it's not cheap. And consider the cost of that when you're considering potential impact from a financial standpoint, especially if you don't have cyber insurance beforehand. For those of you who have regulatory requirements, there's a cost to regulatory compliance and making sure that you have solutions and practices in place that keep you aligned to your regulatory requirements. And then one of my favorite topics is the cost of doing nothing. And this is something that we do run across sometimes, where clients, they either don't consider themselves as high a risk as they are, that the threat against them is minimal, and they elect not to do some of the protective things that we would otherwise encourage them to do. One of the things that we've seen over time, especially with clients who come to us after the fact, they may have been encouraged to put things in place prior to an event. They were resistant, they got breached, and then they come back to us and say, just do everything that you wanted to do because we get it now. That's an unfortunate posture and position, but it does happen, and it has happened with us in our business. Operational impact, interruption and damage to production equipment and systems. That's something that's typically going to impact your revenue and ability to generate revenue if you're not able to produce items or services that are your core business. We think that's important for you to realize that and consider that in the importance of analyzing impact to your business. And then reputational damage, we talked about that again in a couple of spaces. Consumer confidence, shareholder confidence, public confidence. You can look pretty much anywhere where there's been a breach event, these high-profile breach events with organizations where data has been compromised. I would venture to say that your data has been compromised at some point in time. I know mine was within the last couple of years with a rather significant breach that occurred to a well-known entity. Consumer confidence is a serious thing to organizations that if they're seen as somebody who doesn't rightly protect your information, you may not want to do business with them. Shareholders may not want to invest in your organization if you have a reputation for not being one to protect your data. And then public confidence as a whole is something that you really want to have that confidence in your customers, in the public in general, shareholders, etc. So this concludes the overview of the risk assessment. And I know we could spend a lot more time and detail going through that assessment. I hope that some of these items provided nuggets of information that you would consider. I'd encourage you to begin building out your own cybersecurity recovery strategy if you don't have one today. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be different for every organization. We'd love to partner with you if you need some help in that space. It's something that we do on a regular basis with our clients and helping them identify. It's really interesting for me personally as I sit in a room with executives from one of our clients and we walk through and talk through some of these items that we've talked about today, and it's almost like a light bulb goes off. There's a light bulb occurrence for sure, where they realize, well, we hadn't thought about that before. We hadn't thought about this before, but we wind up putting that into a plan that they can then manage against in the event of an emergency or an event, and they can rely on that as something that is a tool that they've developed and something that they've thought through as far as impact to their particular business. And Lisa, I think that brings us to poll question number 4.
Yes, I believe so. Thank you, Dave. Poll question number 4. I'm going to go ahead and launch that so you can put in your response. How often does your organization conduct employee training on cybersecurity best practices? The options are frequently, which would mean quarterly or more often, occasionally, which would be annually, rarely, which would be every few years, and then never. It looks like we've got a few answers already coming in. I'll give just a few more seconds in case there's any stragglers. Okay, yeah, I see someone put in one more answer. So we're just about to end the poll and then share the results. Okay, it looks like most people would say occasionally, and then the next most often answered would be frequently.
And those are good. Those are good, solid rhythms around that. We think organizations providing that level of security awareness training on an annual basis is good. Unfortunately, some folks get to participate in training more often if there are fish testing programs in place, because they get to usually do remedial training if they click something they shouldn't. But a comprehensive security awareness training on an annual basis is really a good practice there. So as we wrap up for today, we're going to put the slide up showing again the future sessions, and I will turn it back over to you, Elisa.
Okay, thank you so much, Dave. And now we'll begin our Q&A live. So if anyone has further questions about anything that Dave shared, but we don't get to your question today, please feel free to reach out to us at info@lbmctech.com. Looks like the first question that came in today is, what are the most critical components of a cybersecurity recovery strategy?
From the aspect of part of that is content that we've not shared today. Inventory of systems, I think, is important. Understanding where your critical systems live is very important. As we talked earlier about recovery methods, knowing the availability and having a roster of people to recover is important. Those are a couple items that I think are important. Where your data is, where your systems are, and then who your recovery partners are, whether it's your internal staff or any vendor partners that might be part of that. In the end, recovery and resumption of normal operations is the goal and the approach. And so as quickly as you can resume normal operations is the target there. But I think, again, knowing where your systems are and who your recovery resources are pretty important components.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dave. Oh, we do have another question that's come in. The question is, how often should a cybersecurity recovery plan be reviewed and updated?
Yeah. That is pretty much an annual exercise. And for the clients where we've done that work, we are committed to an annual review of that. A couple of things we do around that. Once we have a base plan developed for recovery, what we tend to do is, and we didn't talk about this in this session, but we tend to have a tabletop exercise where we will create a mock scenario, whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's a breach event. And then we will pull the plan that's been developed and we'll step through that plan and make adjustments to that plan for that specific scenario. And what that does is that allows us to update the plan year over year for specific scenarios and allows us to refine the plan as we go through test or mock scenarios. We think annually is the right rhythm for that. And I would just say that in that, we would encourage you to do a tabletop exercise with a different scenario to manage against each time that you do that.
Excellent. Okay. It does look like we have some more questions coming in, so maybe just a couple more here. The next question would be, what are the common pitfalls to avoid when developing a cybersecurity recovery strategy?
I would say assuming too much or assuming a certain availability of a system, a resource, what have you. When we talked about identifying your critical systems, identifying your staff, having that assumption that staff may be fully available for recovery, that replacement inventory, if you have to replace physical assets, is going to be available depending on the disaster. Again, if it's a natural disaster, that you may end up with supply chain issues, things of that nature. We saw that certainly during COVID, that supply chain was impacted in a very non-technical way, based on a very non-technical event, I should say, COVID. In a breach event, pitfalls there would be failure to have backed up your data, failure to have tested your backups, failure to have immutable backups. Backups are a very big piece of disaster recovery, whether it's natural disaster or breach event type events. The state of your backups is perhaps the greatest one that I've mentioned here. So we can't place enough emphasis on that. Again, that's going to be brought out, I believe, in one of the future sessions. Actually, session 2, we see right there.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it looks like maybe the last one that's been put into the Q&A will be the question, will my cyber insurance policy cover recovery in an IT disaster scenario?
I think the answer I would give you is it depends. For the most part, I think cyber insurance policies do cover a variety of situations with regard to a disaster or breach event, whether it's paying for ransomware or whether it's paying for various recovery services, physical equipment that has to be reprovisioned, things of that nature. The it depends part of my answer is, it goes back to something I mentioned earlier, again, was around the items that you attest to on a cyber insurance application and ensuring that you have those in place if you have a breach event. A couple of points on that is, as I review those applications with clients, we want to make sure that solutions that we've implemented as their partners, their managed services partner, are reflected in that application. It may be that we've added a solution since the last time they reviewed their application that strengthens their application. So we were able to check a different box to enhance their application. So that's a good thing. By the same token, if the client is attesting to a solution or a service or policy that they don't have in place, but say they are, and have a breach event, they're at risk of not having their claim paid, for one thing. We've seen that happen where, not personally with a client of ours, but we've seen that happen in the recovery space where, in probably one of the more famous cases, a breached entity had indicated they had MFA, multi-factor authentication, implemented across their organization, and the breach event actually occurred due to lack of multi-factor authentication. The underwriting entity did not pay the claim. In fact, I think came back for punitive damages against the claiming organization. That's an important thing, is to just make sure your policy or your application for your policy aligns with your solutions. And the more solutions that you have in place, generally the stronger your application is going to be. And I suspect that would drive your premiums down as well.
Great. All right. That is all the Q&A that we had come in for today. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today. We do look forward to seeing you in the future. We have the 3 other sessions planned quarterly this year, and as Dave mentioned, we will continue this series into next year. It's a large conversation, and we want to be sure that we can dive deep with you all on those. We hope this webinar on developing a strong cybersecurity recovery strategy has been informative and valuable to everyone who joined us today. And if you have any further questions or need guidance on how to get started, please remember our team is always available to support and assist you. Again, thank you for attending today.